This presentation is derived from the Liveable Cities research program, which I'm involved with here at UCL. There are a number of universities, Birmingham, Southampton and Lancaster, involved in this program. And this is a little snapshot from that research program called Liveable Cities. And this is to do with re-engineering our version of how cities might be in the future. So, how do we go about thinking about a radical revisioning of the engineering of cities? So to start with, we have to worry about what is engineering. Engineering actually has an interesting history. Engineering started with a Latin word meaning an ingenious person, someone who was creative and someone who thought about things right from the beginning. Leonardo da Vinci was one of the first people to ever hold the title of engineer. But since then, a number of people had. In France, engineering was codified in the 18th century, and in Britain, it was professionalized in the 19th century. UCL has the privilege of holding one of the oldest civil engineering chairs in the country, and my colleague Nick Tyler, who's involved in this program, holds one of the oldest civil engineering chairs. And I am the first engineering policy professor in the United Kingdom. So UCL has a long heritage of being involved in breaking new ground in engineering. So why is it a good idea to start thinking about cities now? What is it that's special about now that needs us to reconsider how we make cities livable? There's a number of quotations that I've used to illustrate this point. Firstly, from Richard Rogers, Lord Rogers, that this is actually a pivotal time not only in the UK but in Western Europe, in the older part of the world, for urban regeneration. We have to start thinking about how we rebuild our cities for the future. And there's a lot of new factors, which I'll come to later, that we need to think about. Not only that, we begin to understand that people who live in cities have the right to have certain expectations of how cities should be for them. That they should be able to walk around peacefully in a secure and beautiful environment. That they can walk safely, unhampered, down streets. And that those streets are nice for them. They're not littered with rubbish or with extraneous signs or with dangerous people. Cities are islands in the countryside, and so it's just as important that we look after the countryside around cities, the hinterland as we call it, as well as the cities itself. And if we neglect the hinterland, we're going to neglect the cities. So there's a number of quotations like that. They're also economic capitals of our activity, some more capital than others, and we will be competing over which cities are the most successful over the next few decades. They also excite creativity. A lot of the creativity that has come about in the human race in the last 300 or 400 years has occurred as a result of activities in cities. And so we need to continue to engender that creativity and that capability to dream about what might be, so that the imaginings of people, the creative people, can actually take fruit inside cities. But if we neglect them, if we just assume they'll always be there, then we'll most likely not look after ourselves very well at all, and we certainly won't look after the planet. In about 30 or 40 years' time, 70% of the people on the planet will be living in something like 70 cities and producing something like 70% of the world's gross domestic product. So it's very important that cities are looked after, and that is why we need to look after them now, why we need to start thinking about the next 50 years now in order that we survive properly in our city environments. Just to reflect back on the purpose of engineering, historically the purpose of engineering, as this slide illustrates, has been very much to do with the design of devices, machines, building structures to provide the built environment and the functionality of cities without taking too much notice of all the other factors. The material living standards, that's what cities really started delivering, was material living standards and health standards that were much better than had been the case before. But we now need to extend the purpose of engineering so that it includes protecting the habitat, the natural resources of our environment, promoting the mental and cultural well-being of the people who live in those cities, and ensuring that we also have resource availability for future generations, that cities don't become sinks for all the raw materials, the food, the energy, and everything else that we need to live in a developed world. So the purpose of engineering is broader than it used to be. That means we need to revision the concept of engineering, and that's what we're about in this programme. The structure of the programme, which I just briefly put up, illustrates the number of lenses, as we're calling them, that we look at the revisioning of cities through. And I'm actually responsible for the policy lens. How do governments and institutions reflect on the policies that are needed in order to make cities sustainable in the way that I've described? But there are, of course, others. There's engineering lens, there's information lens, there's the environment lens. They're all equally important. And indeed, that is one of the factors that in the past perhaps has been a problem, that one factor, maybe the economic factor or the social stability factor, has been the most dominant lens through which cities have been looked at, sometimes to the detriment of what is looked at through other lenses. And we're trying to work out how to maintain an equilibrium, a balance between these various viewpoints so that cities can go forward in a sustainable but equitable manner. So some of those future contexts that we're starting to think about have a number of properties. Firstly, that more extreme weather events are going to occur, and probably more of them are going to be more extreme. In the recent past, in the last 5 or 6 years, most cities in most parts of the world have suffered to some extent from extreme weather events. Cities are getting denser and they're getting bigger. So both of those factors cause stress on the way in which we think about our city design and our city operation. But cities are not isolated from each other. They are becoming increasingly interdependent on a whole range of different areas, economic, political and cultural. We trade with each other, we have political exchange with each other, we have cultural exchange. And those exchanges, which used to be sort of bilateral and haphazard, are now becoming interdependencies. We couldn't work one without the other. The most mature of that, of course, is in the financial markets, where the financial markets operate as a global network of trading centres which are working 24 hours a day. But we're beginning to see it happen on supply chains for a lot of other products and properties of cities. We also exchange knowledge, and the amount of human knowledge that we have to work with to design and use our cities has increased enormously. However, our wisdom in using that knowledge effectively may not have increased quite as effectively as it could have done. So whilst it would be arrogant to think that this programme is going to suggest we move forward in enlarging the amount of wisdom that's available, we may provide some indicators of where greater wisdom could be exploited. And last but by no means least, we're also discovering that the cost of maintaining the developed society that we all enjoy living in is going up very fast. We need to find cheaper ways of maintaining our developed society and living in the way that we want to. There are properties of cities which are very important to understand because they dictate quite a lot of how we work with the infrastructure of cities. Firstly, cities have high density of almost everything. They have density of people, they have density of buildings, they have density of diverse ethnic populations. They have diversity of the means by which we transport ourselves. Long distances in rural areas tend to be covered by railways or by roads with private transport. In cities, we have a much larger range of ways in which people and goods move around, and we need to be able to accommodate that. We also consume energy in lots of different ways for lots of different purposes. It's one of the richnesses of living in a city. It's why they are so attractive. But we also therefore produce lots of waste, and that waste has to be dealt with in some way. At the moment, we export it from the city, and quite often we bury it in the ground, which is obviously no longer acceptable. So we need to look at the ways in which the waste production of all sorts can be managed better. And of course, because it's fully populated with human beings who need water to survive, water consumption is an increasingly difficult issue for dense, highly consumptive cities. And the new kid on the block, if you like, is data generation and information. With the ICT revolution, data and information about what is going on in the city and its citizens is increasingly a valuable asset. And indeed, the smart revolution, which everyone is talking about as one of the saviours of cities, is based on the exploitation of good data and good information communication technologies. However, if it isn't designed and used properly, it may not be the saviour of cities. It may actually make cities worse. So we need to think about whether smart is really smart. Cities, if they're good, well-run, attractive places, attract inward migration, which of course accelerates the rate at which they grow and consume and produce waste. So we have to be careful we understand what the sustainable benchmarks are for cities, and indeed we are doing a lot of benchmarking work in this project to see how that plays out. And lastly, the interdependency of everything. Anything you touch in one sector, whether it's transport or energy or waste or environment, has an interaction on the other sectors. So we need to understand this complex system of systems in a much better way than we currently do. The opportunities that come from doing this are considerable. Firstly, that the methods that we have available in a whole range of different disciplines we're pulling together in this project in order to see how they're effective in other disciplines. Statistical analyses that may come from sociology may be usable in the built environment, and some of the structural methods, structural approaches can be used from civil engineering into other disciplines. So the mixture of disciplines is producing some richness of scholarship. It also is moving into city governance, into the way in which policies and politics play out in the governance of cities, not only within the city, but between the cities and the nation states in which they sit. So national governance and city governance is a movable area with regard to research, and we're beginning to see tensions already out there in the real world between national and city governance. Engineering can also provide a major way of reducing the cost of maintaining the city. As I'd indicated, the costs are escalating out of sight, and so engineering that is explicitly aimed at reducing the cost of ownership of cities, the cost of running cities, is also a very important opportunity. However, there is a risk that in this ambition for engineering better cities, we use up all the skilled workforce that we have, or worse, that we don't actually educate our workforces through our secondary and tertiary education systems to have the skill sets that we need. So not only do we need financial capital to develop and redevelop our cities, we also need human capital. And that is in short supply in Western Europe in particular, and I suspect is going to be in short supply in other parts of the world. So the drivers and trends for how we organise our cities is changing. Some of the social and behavioural trends that we want people to adopt are very difficult to achieve. In this country, we have the need to consume less water in cities. And people say, well, I'm not going to reduce my water usage until all the water pipes stop leaking. And because in London, at least, a lot of our water system is quite old, we still have quite a lot of leakage of water. And people say, why should I reduce my water consumption when the water company isn't reducing its water leakage? And then there is the attitude that people say, water is what I pay for, and no one's going to tell me how and how much of it I should use. And at the moment, our water is not metered. If it were it to be metered in the way that electricity and gas is, so that we pay for it at the point of use, then that might adopt a different attitude. So metering, smart metering, is a factor that could be incorporated. We're trying to use pricing mechanisms to excite people into using less energy, to insulate their houses, to consume less. However, the social norms for doing that are quite weak. The institutional support hasn't really taken off yet, and the information about how to do it is not that widely available. So we're not taking off anything like as fast as those who advocate we should, based on the predictions and projections of climate change and the effect of climate change on the weather. And then we have a worry that people don't see how it should affect them. It's always someone else who needs to do these things. So the social obligation to behave in a way which is more frugal is not well reinforced, unlike in other areas, for instance, drinking and driving, where most people in developed countries realise that drinking and driving is socially unacceptable. Consuming a lot of energy is not seen to be socially unacceptable. Doing the cool thing, what's fashionable? Unless it becomes fashionable, people may not bother to do it. And we don't have mechanisms whereby there are social comparisons, there are role models, because consuming infrastructural resources, utilities, water, waste, and electrical or gas or oil is not something that is visible to your neighbour. Other things are visible to your neighbour. So it's quite difficult to reinforce the social and behavioural change in this whole area of exploitation of resources. So the research challenges is that actually, although the physical interventions are relatively easy to design and engineer, the behavioural changes are much more difficult. So what we're trying to see is whether we can actually construct devices and systems and artifacts in cities that cause the behavioural change to be a more likely phenomena to occur than not. Can that design cause people to behave in a very different way? Can we see what the rebound and contrary behaviours would be where we design things in a certain way? And can we design these objectives? Can we put these objectives into the designs right at the outset so that behavioural change is part of what we're trying to achieve in the way we design things? And what are the adoption curves? What sort of metrics do we need to understand that people are behaving differently? Smart metering is the tip of the iceberg in that regard. And should there be regulation? To what extent should governments or cities regulate in order to cause people to think about behaving differently? It is a multidisciplinary research programme, as I'd indicated earlier, and that will guide engineering and it'll guide policy, but that reflects back into the social sciences, and therefore the systems which learn and have an intrinsic learning process within them are quite important. And so understanding how learning is embedded in the processes of change and how we reinforce that learning to accelerate change is an intrinsic part of what we're doing. What are we aiming at? What's the purpose of this re-engineering and revisioning the engineering of the city? So what I've got in this slide is just an example of what the built environment in the 22nd century might look like. In other words, roughly 100 years' time. Firstly, will it be designed as an integrated and organic system, one that is continuously able to adapt in the way that we're having difficulty doing now because we didn't think about that? Will it be high density, low rise, mixed use, walkable, which from a lot of points of view is a very fashionable set of words to have right now all in one list? Will we use district heating, where we use waste to provide the local energy for heat and electrical energy? Will we decarbonise the main grid? Because I said the hinterland is just as important as the city. So will we have very large power stations somewhere else and decarbonise that using maybe nuclear or large-scale renewables such as solar? Maybe on a scale of a continent, not on the scale of a nation, with distributed energy storage. Water needs to be recycled. Without recycling water, we're going to have severe water shortage problems. So we need to think about whether we can do that and whether we can have high-intensity horticulture so that we don't have to transport food over long distances with concomitant energy consumption. Can we use local ways of producing product so that we don't have manufactured goods being moved long distances? Not only food, but other items of consumable activity. And will we be moving much more to a service-based economy, even than we are now, instead of producing capital consumer goods? What will our dietary and feeding habits be? At the moment, we know that a significant fraction of the developed world is consuming too many calories. It's moving into a situation where obesity and all the health hazards that come from that are very dangerous. And cities do exacerbate that problem because people don't have to consider doing a lot of physical activity. They can, of course, in gymnasia, but not necessarily in their daily lives. And will we be doing anything about reducing, in 100 years' time, the rate of population growth? And if we do, how will we manage the demographics of that? It'll be post the demographic bulge that we expect to see towards 2070, towards the end of this century. But will we have pervasive behavioural change to achieve that? And what will the global distribution of that look like? Because stresses will occur and result in migration from one part of the world to another if we don't. So we also may expect to see the nature of work change quite considerably as even more advanced ICT becomes available, the ability to move information around wherever you are at huge speed and very large volumes. So that's quite important that we know how that might work. So to provide some thoughts and provocations for the sorts of research questions that our programme is now considering, we have these sorts of issues. That actually, if cities are the places that majority of humans will live, and that's what our expectation is, then we need to have a much better understanding of how human beings and cities interact with each other at a whole range of different scales on a whole range of different top subjects. And that's one of the things we're addressing, is how to go about even doing that analysis and synthesis. But engineering the places that people live in is critical to the success, and it may be even to the survival of the human species. We've become dominant on this planet as a result of using our brains. And our brains are the place where we enact our ingenuity. It's where we do our engineering. So actually what we're advocating in this program is that by revisioning through engineering, the re-engineering of our cities, we're using our ingenuity to the best effect on one of the most important problems we face, which is how and where we live. So we may be entering not only the epoch of the city, we may be entering the epoch of where the role of engineers starts to becoming really, really important for our future. And therefore, how we live is vitally dependent upon the future of engineering. To give you an indication of what this looks like visually, this is a heat map taken from space of the United Kingdom, and where it's red, it's hot, and as you can see, the red blobs are where we have our cities. What is also interesting is the blobs out in the North Sea, up in the top right-hand corner, are where we have oil rigs that are emitting huge quantities of heat as they gather the oil from under the North Sea. Cities come in various shapes and sizes, and the next 4 pictures just show satellite pictures taken by the International Space Station. These pictures are courtesy of NASA, of a number of cities around the world, and you can see the geometry of these cities is different. This one is a very tightly bounded city with a grid pattern of streets, predominantly, with 1 or 2 that aren't grid pattern streets. This is Las Vegas, taken at night, of course. So you can see the grid pattern, but you can also see that Las Vegas, being out in the desert, is very tightly circumscribed. There's nothing outside the boundary of the city because there's nothing there, it's desert. And Las Vegas is extended into the desert but stops where the desert starts. By contrast, we have here a city, Bangalore in India, where you can see the hub of the city, very, very brightly lit at night, but a huge number of small satellite towns all around the edges, and very few arterial roads or transport routes that are lit going out to those places. This is Western Europe and Africa. Again, you can see the density of the cities in Europe, and the lack of density of cities in Africa, and 1 or 2 other places in the Middle East, of course. And then another Indian city, Mumbai, where you can see a mixture of the two, where you can see some lights going out along arterial corridors, but again, lots of satellite towns out towards the edges. For those of you who live in another part of the world, you can also see how empty Australia is. You can see the big cities around the edges and 1 or 2 dots in the middle, but otherwise very, very few signs of human habitation. And indeed a similar picture for New Zealand down towards the bottom right. But if you look at the whole of Asia at night, you can see where the cities are. Where there are lights, that means there are large urban conurbations. And you can see in India and China, Japan, parts of the Middle East and up into Europe, and also down into Indonesia, the rate at which urban development is being illuminated at night by our activity. And this gives you an idea that if we don't do something about maintaining our ability to look after these large urban conurbations for the future by better engineering, we're in danger of not surviving on the planet. So what I hope this talk has given you an idea about is how important cities are for our future, how re-engineering and thinking about the re-engineering and design of our future cities is crucial, and how many factors we have to take into account in order for the human species to survive in the way that it has into at least the next century.